Okay, so let's talk about flex direction. Now, we have a simple layout here where we have one container element and three items, and that's basically it. Now, they have some size just so they don't collapse, some fixed size, but that's not really super important for us here. Now, the question that we're interested in, where do we actually find our flex direction? Now, just by looking at this layout and by our rules that we covered in the theory before, we already might have some suspicion because we can see that those elements are aligned horizontally, right? So that would mean probably the main axis here is the horizontal axis. And so if we remember that, our suspicion would be that the direction of this element is a row direction. And sure enough, here next to our container label, we can see this icon that indicates the actual flex direction, and an arrow going from left to right here actually indicates flex row. Now, this is not the only place where we can find that information. When we look into our inspector, under the flex section, we can find the direction. And now, in a nice world, Unity would actually provide us some tooltips and tell us what those icons actually mean. Now, we can get to that information with a tiny hack. I will just briefly add a new element below our container here, and now we can find that element in our UXML file. This is the element, and the nice thing about it, it has no property set, so it nicely fits on the screen here. And now when we choose it and try to play around with the flex direction, for now you don't see anything because the default flex direction is this first one, but unfortunately we cannot see it. So let's change it. And now when we change it to this third one, we see that this is the flex direction row, which was the same that our container had. Now, let's switch back to this one. And now when you switch back, you can also see the actual default one, which is column. Now, there are two other settings, two other direction settings, which we will ignore for a couple of seconds. For now, we are interested in row and column, and we can see that the arrow that is going vertically represents the column direction, and the arrow that's going left to right represents the row direction. Okay, so I just added this this visual element for us to be able to actually see what the actual name of those icons are. So again, here you can see column and row. This is adjusting when we use the setting. Let's for now ignore the UXML. We don't need this anymore. We now know how to change the direction. So let's go back to our container element and let's actually change it. And now, does this follow the rules? Does this behave as we would expect? We said the elements are aligned along its main axis. And now when we set the flex direction to column, its main axis has switched, and also the alignment of the element switched. So again, let's just see, this is a flex direction of row, and this is a flex direction of column. So perfectly, that is the behavior that we described in our theory. Now, let's just again summarize and kind of simplify what we actually need to know about this. And as we already said, the only thing that we need to know is that elements are aligning along its main axis. So in this case, the main axis is horizontal, left to right, and that's how our elements align. So when we only keep in mind this rule, you can describe changing the flex direction slightly different, not by saying anything about the elements, but the only thing that you need to say is that what happens when the flex direction changes is that the main axis changes, because now our main axis has changed to the vertical axis, and then our elements again align along the main axis, and that's our result. So elements align along the main axis, and flex direction switches the main axis from a horizontal in row to a vertical in column. Okay, so we basically described row and column now, and now we can finally also briefly look at those other two options. Now let's again go back to our kind of lonely empty item here that we are misusing to be able to read what Unity is not showing us in tooltips as they should. So, and let's now choose the other options, and you can see those are named column reverse and row reverse. So as it would make sense, we have a bottom down, which is a row, and as it would make sense, we have an arrow that is pointing down for our column, and then a arrow that is pointing up for our column reverse, and along the same lines, we have a left-right arrow for row and right-left for row reversed. And now you might already have some expectations about what this is actually doing. So when we said that row and column are basically switching the axis from vertical to horizontal. Now, what the reversed options are, they are basically mirroring your axis to the other side. So when we would imagine that we have some kind of some middle here, when we now reverse the row, we basically switch the axis on the same dimension, right? So we turn it from not going left to right, but going right to left. And the same thing happens when we go to a column orientation. We again switch the axis, except that now our middle was kind of here, because those elements don't have any room to occupy more space. That's why you didn't have this jump. But what you can notice here is that this mirroring means that the elements actually change their order, right? So where in the normal column setup, we have item 1, item 2, item 3. When we reverse the container, now our first item is on the bottom, our second item stays in the middle, and our third item is now the first item, because we are kind of interpreting this thing bottom up. And the same thing happens with, I'm changing the wrong item, I want to have the container. The same thing happens with row reversed, where now our first element is at the end. Why? Because our axis starts here, so it looks like this, and that's why the red element is the first and the green element, item 3, is the last one when you interpret it from the right side.